Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about language change in Creoles, and I want to put more of a focus on social expansion and social styling. So traditional approaches to changing Creole languages have invoked this notion of Creole or decreolization, whereby essentially the assumption is that the Creole over time turns into a European language as a result of various replacement activities. So for example, the past marker Ben is replaced by a form that looks much more like English did, for example. But what this research has also found out is that essentially the English form that is chosen isn't necessarily the one used in English, or doesn't originally have the same function, but continues to function a bit more like the original form. But the idea is that over time, with lots of replacement processes taking place, the grammar becomes closer and closer to English. Now, there are obviously several problems with this approach. First of all, it hasn't really happened that Creoles get completely erased, and this model would simply suggest that that would be happening. So that's not really possible. There have been other challenges against the viability from a socio-historical background and so on and so forth. Another aspect that I think is quite crucial is that when we look at language context settings, we normally see that lots of different things are happening at the same time, but here one process is basically promoted as bringing about change, and it would seem weird that Creole settings are so much different from other context settings. Equally interesting is the fact that there is a target, that the assumption is that the target of Creole speakers are just European languages, as if this is the only social dimension that's of importance. Another aspect is the fact that there's only a focus on structural linguistic elements, although most speakers tend to focus on meaning-making elements, but that hasn't been integrated into the language. And finally, the assumption is that language change sweeps through the language without any differences. But we know from historical models that there is a so-called wave model that seems much more sensible. The change starts somewhere and then slowly continues on. Right, there's also some research on social change in Creole languages, or particularly where Creole languages have been taken to new contexts. So for example, Jordan and Angeli show, for example, that young people from the Solomon Islands are no longer aligning with the native or the kind of heritage languages of the Solomon Islands, of their parents or grandparents, but that they are connecting their identity to Solomon Islands Creole. But that we also find that when they use Solomon Islands Creole, they don't use it in exactly the same way that their parents or grandparents are using it. So they're not only using it as their main language of interaction, but they're also using it in a different way. And one of the things that they're identifying is the mixing with English, for example. And they also discuss a number of social factors that play a role, and social identity formation plays an important role from their perspective. Now, one thing that is interesting also in their paper is that they also focus just on one process, namely the fact that people are dealing with hybridity, or that they're trying to use hybridity in order to come about with their own identity. Thirdly, there's so-called diaspora language studies. So there's quite a lot of research in the area of multilingualism that looks at how newcomers to a setting acquire and deal or work with the language which traditionally used to be the host language, or the language that is the main language in that context. So people look at, are they speaking the language, for example, English in Canada, in exactly the same way as other Canadians, or is there a development of ethnolex, for example, that are variably used in order to distinguish them? Is this somehow linked then to identities, or is this maybe just an acquisition phenomena of the first language communities and so on and so forth. So here again, we see a certain kind of hybridity being the focus, but it's much more covert in the sense that people are speakers of, say, Canadian English, but they maintain certain kinds of feature that mark them out among themselves or generally to the population as different. Finally, I'd say there is but relatively little use or discussion about how so-called heritage languages are used in dominant language discourses to develop certain strategies. So Rampton, for example, would be an important reference here. Now, in this paper, I want to kind of draw a little bit from the different kinds of approaches, and what I want to look at are the different mechanisms and processes that are involved in change from Maroon of language among Maroon populations in urbanizing French Guiana. And specifically here, I want to take a relatively broad perspective, but I will be looking mainly from what could be called the maintained or the original language. I will not say much about how they, I will not say much about how people deal with French or how they speak French. So for my data, I draw on lots of different types of data, observation, recordings, a survey, and so on and so forth. Just for those of you who might not know, Maroon populations originally come from Suriname. They are the descendants of people who left the island, left the plantations, the sugar plantations, and then set up their own communities. And traditionally, they're associated with the interior of the Surinamese and the French Guyanese rainforest, where they were living basically in relatively isolated villages, and the main contact between villagers and the mainstream society was relatively slight, and it was mainly men who were setting up these kinds of contacts. Since the 1950s, though, we see a lot more migration towards the coastal area, both Suriname, but also French Guiana, where there was a lot of work going on at the time. So people worked in deforestation, but also in the developing industries. But this kind of migration was really in a way circular. Men went away for months and then came back, but the rest of the community literally stayed in situ. That dramatically changed in the 1980s with the Suriname Civil War that displaced most Maroon population and Amerindian populations, and a lot of them went towards French Guiana, where they sought refuge from the Surinamese army. And most people didn't really return to Suriname. And so what we find in the 1980s, we see first a kind of constant movement between villages, Suriname and French Guiana, but increasingly people were basically getting established in French Guiana, and especially the western part of French Guiana. And that by itself then attracted more people, on one hand metropolitan French and Antillean French people who were manning the newly developing services, but also other migrants from Haiti, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, Western French Guiana suddenly expanded quite rapidly and became a multi-ethnic city or multi-ethnic area, and Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni kind of the center of a multilingual and multicultural center. But nevertheless, Maroons always remained quite dominant simply because they are the dominant group in the area. And over that kind of migration continued. But what we started to see suddenly, especially the migration from the interior villages, is that we first started to see first generation of Maroons who had entirely grown up on the coast and had very little everyday connection to the village other than the kinds of families connections. And since probably that time, a little bit later, around 2010, we see that there's also people leaving school, becoming professionals, greater integration into what could possibly be called the French Guyanese mainstream. And then probably from 2015 onwards, we see circular migration, part for training and work, but also for other reasons to France, and between France and French Guiana. While all of this kind of movement towards Europe or the mainstream of French Guiana has started, but at the same time, the transnational networks between Maroons in Guyana, Suriname, the Netherlands and France stay pretty strong, and there's still a very strong feeling of this is one community. Right, so there's just a little bit of background. Okay, now let's look at some of the changes that we can find. I'll talk about them more at a high level rather than giving you lots of data. So the first kind of macro-linguistic change that we can see is that there's been a change in the kind of linguistic repertoire. When people were living in the villages, while people weren't entirely monolingual, and that's particularly men, it is true that their main language of communication were the Maroon Creoles. But this has changed because people have now become, on the one hand, people have started using Sranantongo to a much higher level, which they beforehand used much more covertly. People are using much more Dutch and French, because that's for those coming from Suriname, but those in French Guiana using French because it is something that they learn in school and that they need for lots of things that they do within French Guiana. There's also much greater interest in international languages like English. And so what we see is emerging a population of bilinguals. Probably anybody from around their 40s onwards has varying degree of knowledge in French, and is usually bilingual in at least the Maroon language and French, but then also has certain competences in Sranantongo. At the same time, we see that the use of Sranantongo as a separate language, as in Suriname, is not quite very well developed in French Guiana, but it seems that it is a particular style within the Maroon Creole that has developed that uses quite a lot of Sranantongo vocabulary, but would not be recognized as Sranantongo by most, as actual Sranantongo by most people. What we still see, though, is that Maroon languages are highly valued among people, and that they're also widely used for communication within the family and among family community members and for community activities. Another change that we see, and that was already documented by others, is this this hybridity. So yeah, we do see quite a lot of mixing of languages. So just to put this in perspective, there are several different speech styles within the Eastern Maroon Creole, for example, and one of them that is called Wakamantongo has always been there, and it was always the kind of style that used quite a lot of mixing with Sranantongo. But what was interesting is that it was always a specific category language, in the sense that it was linked to younger men, people who would who tend to leave the village for work-related matters and engage with the urban context. But it has heavy overtones of rudeness from that, or has traditionally had very heavy overtones of rudeness from that perspective. But with migration to town, something has dramatically changed here. Namely, suddenly that style of speaking became much more quantitatively, much more important, because you could hear it a lot more, say, in Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni. While initially people were complaining about that, it quickly normalized as into, okay, this is the way people speak in French Guiana. And there is lots of different reasons, and I've listed a couple here. Of course, it was always a language from Maroons, or a practice that was always associated with the urban context. The urban context is heavily dominated by younger people until now even. And so they are the most visible people. People have a lot more interaction with non-Maroons, and that's the code that was always used for non-Maroons. And it is also not the traditional swear, so it fits to use that style and to expand it. So while it has normalized and expanded, and it is much more widely used, we still see restrictions on this code. Women still don't like to use it too much because it has negative overtones, similar to older men who are normally community leaders. They usually stay away from it, or they make much less pronounced use of it. One thing that's interesting about this practice is that the practice that we see in town is that a lot of times when you look at the practice, it is not always easy to tell, are people speaking a Maroon language with Sranan insertion or vice versa. And I think that's kind of a desire that people want to be relatively fuzzy and do not want to place themselves with Maroon or Sranan Tongu, but stay within the general spheres. But at the same time, the traditional styles have not been replaced as suggested by Bickerton's model, for example. They still exist, but they have just receded into the home and the local community activities the local community activities, and obviously they continue to exist also in the village context. But what we also see quite in recent years now, and I'd say that's in the last, say, 10 years or so, we see a new kind of hybridity rising, namely a new kind of mixing between a Maroon language and a European language, and not so much Sranan Tongu. In fact, when you look at it clearly, you see very little Sranan Tongu. And what I often see, especially in French Guiana, the style seems to be very insertional in the sense that you have very strong feeling that people are speaking a Maroon language, but they're inserting in liminal places, pragmatic markers and so on and so forth, in verbal forms into their speech, as if a certain kind of thing is being focused on, but it is not kind of the main practice. This code is mainly aligned with professionals who work in European language contexts, teachers, healthcare professionals, administrative workers, and so on and so forth. And the way I can observe that it is very much an insertion of a separate identity. So people in French Guiana tended to often see, or were often seen as satellites to the Paramaribo group of people, but they are basically asserting a separate identity in that particular style. This style is actually expanding as because the population of French speakers and French Maroon speakers is expanding. And what is interesting here, unlike the other hybrid style, this one carries a much less problematic notion. So especially women find it much easier to use it. Now, there's very few older men who use it, but it is something that you see much more frequently than the Sranan Maroon's mixing style, simply because it has very positive overtones with learning and so on and so. The other mixed style still exists, but it has become kind of the working class and the kind of talk of truth notion. So yes, hybridity is important, but there are different sorts of hybridities, A, and B, I think one thing that is important is that we also look at where it takes place. So just going back to some of that, one of the things I found is that it is taking place mainly in contexts that I would call public or identity performing contexts, so discussions with outsiders, hierarchical contexts among young people, and so on and so forth. Many, in response to, so when people were asked sometimes, could they give a reason why they were using this particular code, they were, what's going on? So these kinds of hybrid forms take place in hierarchical, in public contexts where there are notions of identity performance. So on the one hand, when talking to outsiders, so say in surveys, people often do that in order to foreground a particular identity, but also I've remarked when, say, a group of, say, people are together, younger people are together, and they have a bit of a contentious discussion, then you find that people might engage in these hybrid forms as a way of showing power, for example. And when asked why people do that, they often say, well, it's important for me to also show that I'm educated. So using hybridity often has this notion of showing either hybridity or sophistication and so on and so forth. Whereas in the community context, mixed speech is much more guarded, because it's still seen as kind of wanting to surpass the local context. So one way where you can see it quite a lot is that people use it in kind of a code switching style. So again, as not so much as a mixed context, but more as a way of code switching. So for example, one day I observed a context where in a place where pretty much everybody speaks Maroon language, one person comes to the yard of another person, greets them in the Eastern Maroon Creole, the other person replies in the Eastern Maroon Creole. But then when the discussion turns to prices about the product that's being sold, then there's a quick switch to French. And then the discussion is finished again in the Maroon language. So it seems a bit like there's this certain kinds of business style happens in French now. Okay, let's look at a particular context. So one thing where I see a lot of change happening is in what we could call notions of respect. These notions of respect are very important for the community and play a very central role in how things are being managed or interactions are managed within the community. But interestingly enough, they are showing the greatest amount of change, but that change is much less obvious. And what we often see is that the change is not based on external model or direct external models, for example. So let's look at that in detail. So first of all, when we look at what is happening in the language right now, as more and more people become professionalized in the urban context, we see suddenly that the Eastern Maroon Creole and Ninga has made inroads in lots of different new domains. So we can see them in the radio sector. I think by now there are 4 stations, 2 in French Guiana, 2 in Suriname. There's a YouTube discussion forum. There's lots of music videos, dubbed films, original films. There's a bilingual school program in French Guiana. There is a not necessarily bilingual, but a regional language program that uses Maroon languages, for which there's a lot of material that's being produced in Maroon languages. We see that there's more publications and so on and so forth, and people are using Maroon languages for association meetings. In all of these contexts, possibly with the exception of music videos, I'd say, there's always a very strong focus on this idea of we use respect speech. Now, typically, this would be the kind of palaver speech that is typical of the palaver context in the village, but we find that that's not actually the case. Or what we could say is that this palaver style is being changed into a new form. So let's look at some of those kinds of changes that are taking place. So people are agreeing to use what they consider to be polite speech. They have particular notions of what that is, but now let's see what exactly people are doing. So one thing that is very obvious is that the traditional polite speech is very much focused on negative politeness, so non-imposition strategies and so-called non-directness strategies. But one thing that is very clear is that in order to properly do this style and to understand this style, it is very important that you actually learn this style, and it requires quite a lot of skill. And it is otherwise quite opaque. So one thing that we see now that is happening in all of those new contexts where polite speech has been brought to or is being brought to, we see a number of changes. And it is particularly these, what I would call opaque strategies, that are being changed or that are being adapted. So for example, traditionally, there's a lot of long and culturally involved metaphors that have been used in order to represent things. That's a kind of a way of doing discussion indirectly or to avoid direct attack. So what we see is that people are might be using certain kinds of short sayings at the beginning of a discourse and at an end of a discourse and here or there, but more or less these kinds of speech, these kinds of sayings have been reduced and nearly omitted for particular purposes. And they're definitely much less frequent. Then the traditional speech style, polite style has a lot of what I would call special vocabulary to represent things in order to save face. But a lot of these forms might not be so widely known anymore, or are not widely used anymore. But what we find is that instead of using these specialized forms, people use basically typical speech from the village context. So they are targeting the village context as polite, and they're putting a speaking style, and they're putting that into those kinds of speech styles in order to perform respectfulness. And a very overt feature is the ritual responding, whereby basically the speech is monological, but it is made by dialogical by a person frequently responding to what the other person is saying. So the speaker leaves frequent gaps in their speech, and a ritual responder says something like, yes, okay, I will do that, yes, and oh, isn't that terrible? But there's a particular game in which this has to be done. But that particular style has pretty much been removed. What people are doing is they're just leaving gaps. And sometimes they also leave what is called conversational feedback. Yes, But more typically, nothing. There's just a gap in the speech. And so that's a new way of doing that. There's also a couple of new features that have entered this speech style, and I'll just note some that are in line with the ones I mentioned before. So we find that these kind of integrated politeness practices with typical metaphors and so on, they have been removed, and what we see is, or they have been lessened, I should say. So, but what we see is so-called overt politeness practices. So people regularly apologize for doing things. They give out warnings at the beginning of speeches, or as when discussions get a little bit out of hand. But they avoid, say, the metaphors or the special vocabulary. The other thing is, in the traditional talk, there is no direct address of speakers. It is always basically buffered by certain kinds of people who do ritual responding work around that. But here, in these kinds of discourses, we see that people are putting direct questions to each other. They are directly calling on each other. And people are also, in some of the discussions, such as the YouTube show, they talk quite overtly about taboo topics. They are still disguising some of that discussion, but they usually mention it and then basically find placeholders to talk about it. But the discussion is clearly overt for most everybody. We also see that the traditional politeness, courtesy titles are no longer used in the same way. It's typically only used now for older people as a sign of respect, but for everybody else, it's usually first names that are used in order to respond to each other. And increasingly, you also see that people are naming their European first names. This is slightly different in face-to-face communication that is not mediated, where people are also using their local first names. And finally, while mixing is still considered to be a problematic strategy, we do see more mixing happening, typically with European language, but it is still relatively low, and I'd say it's, in most cases, it's below 30%. But what is interesting is that there's very little effort being made to integrate it phonologically within the Eastern Maroon constructions or structures, but that people use very European phonological structures or phonotactics in order to when using these forms. So what we find then is that there is this new style of politeness being or emerging. So we now have at least two different styles of politeness, the more traditional palaver form, and we have the adapted form. And then there are also slight differences from one context to another, of course. Okay, so what are the main implications that we can draw here? So the Eastern Maroon Creole has seen quite a social expansion. So Maroons continue to use it as a community and home language, especially the polite form is heavily used in those kinds of contexts to work out social problems and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the language itself and this particular style is being spread as a result of the activities that Maroons are undertaking. Okay, and when we look more in general, we can see that that as a result of these changes, we see different kinds of forms, different kinds of changes happening. So on the one hand, we see different forms of hybridization taking place. So hybridization with Shona and one with European languages, and they have different functions. And on the other hand, we see that basically there are a lot of internal changes happening that are not visible on the outside. So in a way, the language is being changed from the inside out, but it is also changed from the outside in, while at the same time it is being propagated much more widely. So what are the different reasons for these changes? Now, in particular, with regard to the politeness practice, we see younger people have much less access to traditional politeness practice because there aren't that many palavers and so on happening in the local urban context. Okay, so that's important. Then we find that the kinds of fora that people are using are different from the ones that are used in the traditional form. So as a result of when we look at a news show or we look at an association, we see that different kinds of participation structures are needed in those kind of contexts that are different from the traditional ones. So as a result of the change in the participation structures of these particular new settings, we find that different kinds of language practices need to be developed. Some need to go, other new ones need to be developed. So, for example, suddenly direct dialogues are necessary, so people need to find new ways of doing politeness in direct dialogue, so they develop new strategies around that. And one reason also why people like to promote these polite forms is because they also want to obviously distinguish, or they want to dissociate from the traditional forms, because in the traditional palaver context, young people typically have very little to say, because all of that is handled by foreigners, by elders, sorry. So certain kinds of features that they have identified, so certain kinds of features also that they've identified in the traditional forms that typically do not give them a voice, are the kinds of things that they would like to also remove then from the kinds of formal talk that they use for themselves. So there's different processes going on. So on the lack of access on the one hand, different kinds of affordances, because these are different contexts from the palaver context, but also different notions of what's appropriate talk, or what do we think actually promotes our communication. And all of these together bring about the change. So in a way then, modernize or bringing modernity in a lot of ways for people then means adapting language and not giving up their language, but basically being dynamic with your language. Okay, so in conclusion, yes, languages are changing, and when they leave their so-called homeland, That's quite clear, and Creoles are not an exception to that. Hybridity plays an important role in most contexts and in most Creole contexts as well, because movement from the rural context to the urban context usually also means insertion into a new linguistic context. But one thing that people often, or that we often don't look at, is that these kinds of overt changes, hybridity, are not the only things that are happening. There's also a lot of things happening internally. And this is because people's ways of thinking about social situations, about identities and forms of engagement are changing. And as a result of that, as in the same way as it happens in the same with the European languages, there is a change also then in the linguistic shapes, but we haven't really been looking at that very much. So transplanting and recontextualizing practices means that practices acquire new meanings. They will be structurally adapted. And over time, those adaptations become normalized and turn into new practices then. I hope I've also managed to show a little bit that when we talk about change in diaspora communities, we cannot say that there's one change in one direction, but there's actually multiplicity of changes that are taking place. And I think it's important to stress, as other researchers have done before, that change is always centrifugal and centripetal at the same time. So things are happening in one direction and then into another one, and sometimes they happen toward, there's convergence and there's divergence at the same time. But in order to see all of these changes, we need to take what I would call a larger perspective. So that in order to capture all that change, one of the things we need to do is to study the overall linguistic context and not just that language. And we also look we need to probably look at it over time to see what are the changes that have happened, and also how are things happening at this very moment. This obviously requires quite a bit of involvement, often from an ethnographic perspective. We also need to look much more closely at socially embedded notions of language. How do people conceptualize their language, and then what do they do to that language and how? Because otherwise we can't get to the actual reasons of why language is changing. Okay, so then finally, greater attention is to be paid to actually what we call situated language use. So not just asking people to do things for us, but recording them in the situation, observing them in the situations in which they normally interact without us prompting them to interact there. So it's interactional data that we need, but I also think that commentary, that is ideological data, is very important in order to get a handle on why people are doing things, because otherwise it's just us telling people what they're doing. Okay, thanks very much. Bye.